For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Paul isn't really talking about the circumcision itself. I mean, obviously your circumcision can't really become uncircumcision. So he's using this as a metaphor. Does somebody have Galatians 5:6 ready?
Okay, Galatians 5, chapter 5, verse 6. For in Messiah Yeshua, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision amounts to anything, but faith working through love.
Yeah, you know, Paul wrote both of those verses. He said circumcision nor uncircumcision amounts to nothing, but then he also said circumcision indeed is of value. There's a tendency to take Paul in sound bites. And, you know, it's what I call soundbite theology. And you take one verse and you build the whole theology around it and ignore all the verses around it, ignore everything that Paul said everywhere else. But you'll never understand Paul by doing that. If you really want to understand what he's talking about, you have to take every word he says in the context of all of his other letters and then understand those in context of especially Torah. I mean, you need to know all of Tanakh and the Gospels and Acts, but really Paul is, almost all of his letters in some way are a commentary on Torah. So when he says circumcision is of value, and then in Galatians he says circumcision doesn't mean anything, what does he mean? How do you reconcile those? Yeah, overall, I think Paul is talking about being faithful to the covenant, being faithful to the spirit of the law, where when he's talking about circumcision here, most of the time he's not talking just about the physical act of circumcision. He's using it as what's called a metonymy, which means it's one thing used to talk about a whole collection of things. So it's like if trying to think of a good example. If I say I'm headed up to the Great White North, everybody knows what that means. It doesn't mean that I'm going up to the Arctic Circle, although it could. It means I'm going somewhere to Canada. In this case, Paul is saying whenever he says circumcision, the first thing you should think of is rabbinic Judaism, or what passed as rabbinic Judaism in the first century. The whole rabbi system wasn't really solidified in the way that it is today, so it didn't quite look the same. But all the collection of traditions and all the extra rules, the 18 steps of conversion, and primarily this is the thing that he's talking about. When he says, if you go and get circumcised, Christ will mean nothing to you. But what he means is, if you go and you go through this process of conversion into Judaism so that you can be a Jew and think that's going to save you, then why did Christ die for you? Because that's not what he said. And so when he says circumcision, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, means anything in Galatians 5:6, he's saying it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or you're not a Jew. What matters is that you are faithful to the covenant. You're faithful to God. And you can be circumcised and still not be of the circumcision. Now, you can't be uncircumcised and be of the circumcision, because that was the gateway. I mean, you go through all these steps, and the last one was to be circumcised, at least as a man. And that made you a Jew in the eyes of Jews. And that's going to be a little more important here in a few verses.
So, Jay, circumcision was emblematic of joining the faith, if you will, of joining. Mm-hmm. It was a declaration. So if you make a declaration and you follow the tenets of what you're declaring, great. But if you make a declaration and you just do what you want, it's not applicable. So thus, Paul's statement in Galatians about it doesn't mean anything one way or the other. He's talking about, I believe, more or less your adherence to your beliefs as opposed to doing something emblematic. The emblematic action is not necessarily, sure, it's a good thing. I'm, I got some sort of, let's say I had a tattoo, if that were, and I'm now part of the club, so to speak, great. Mm-hmm. But if you get your tattoo and you don't adhere to what the club's rules are, then, what difference does that make,
Yeah. There are a lot of reasons that somebody will go through that process. And, some people just want that tattoo. They want the bragging rights. They want to be able to wear the ring or whatever it is. Um, a lot of politicians will become Freemasons, even if they weren't before, because it opens doors for them. And many of them don't actually believe anything that the Freemasons teach. They really don't believe much of anything at all. But they do it because they know that there's this fraternal order, and they've got a relationship established with people in cities all over the world because they wear this ring, or they know the right handshake, or whatever the identifier is. And the same thing is true of being Jewish. There are a lot of people who convert to Judaism just because they want to be part of that network, or they admire the religious tradition and all the ritual. And this is especially prevalent in Hollywood. All kinds of Hollywood stars and starlets will convert to Judaism because it opens doors. It makes connections with producers and financiers and all kinds of people who will help them get roles and further their career, or because it's just the in thing to do in that crowd, not because they actually believe in anything that Judaism teaches. And so if they go through all this process so they can wear the ring or get the tattoo, and it has no value to them at all eternally, God doesn't see them as any different than they were before they did all this. And that's what Paul is talking about when he's saying, if you go and get yourself circumcised, Christ means nothing to you. He doesn't mean that there's no value in physical circumcision, because God wouldn't command anybody to do things that there's no value in. So it does say that circumcision is a good thing. It's not required for salvation. First off, it's not something that any of the apostles said. None of them said, in order to earn eternal salvation, you need to be circumcised. But there are some stories that illustrate this principle. For example, I think Paul also points this out, that Abraham was called and declared righteous before he was circumcised. The Hebrews were brought out of Egypt before they were circumcised, saying, okay, in future Passovers, you need to be circumcised if you're going to eat the Passover. But he didn't enforce that in the wilderness. They were all saved. They were all saved from Egypt, which is a metaphor of both sin and condemnation, slavery to sin. And it's real. I'm not saying it's not a real story. I'm just saying that real stories in Scripture are also metaphor. It wasn't until they got into the promised land that all of those men in the wilderness were circumcised. But they crossed the Jordan, they crossed the Red Sea, then they crossed the wilderness where they were there in the camp with God. And then they crossed the Jordan into the promised land. And only then did God tell Joshua, okay, let's fix this problem. Everybody who hasn't been circumcised, circumcise them. And then they ate Passover. The circumcision wasn't the thing that rescued them from Egypt. It was their faith in following God.